Get out of our house, all of you.
It was a few days after my husband, Mike, passed away when suddenly 9 of his relatives barged into our home. Apparently, they believed this house was theirs, and I, an outsider, should leave. But I couldn't help but burst into laughter when I heard their claim. Not knowing the full story, they glared at me, demanding to know what was so funny. Don't you all know? I then revealed to them a certain wish that Mike had entrusted to me before he passed. Hearing this, Sarah, my mother-in-law, and the rest of them went pale. Shocked by the truth, they were left completely speechless. My name is Emily Williams. I'm 52 years old and work in the kitchen of a local restaurant.
Emily, can you stay late today?
Hey, come on, you know Emily can't work overtime right now.
That's right. She has to visit her husband in the hospital, remember? We all agreed we'd cover for her until he's discharged.
Oh, that's right. Sorry about that, Emily. You can head out on time today.
Our restaurant is one of the most popular places in town. Cheap, delicious, and huge portions. Because of that, there's always a long line of customers every day. I used to happily take on overtime, but recently, my husband Mike was diagnosed with cancer and is now in the hospital. So, I've been leaving work right on time to visit him. Mike is 2 years older than me at 54. We've been married for 30 years, and this is the first time he's faced such a serious illness. Although it was discovered during a routine checkup, the cancer had already spread to several places, and after the diagnosis, his health rapidly declined.
I'm so pathetic. Working from home all the time drains my strength.
He works from home as an interior coordinator. Since he worked as a freelancer, he was able to handle all his tasks with just one laptop. Thanks to that, Mike took care of most of the housework, leaving me free to work from morning till night. However, after he collapsed from cancer, I had to ask my workplace for a favor and change my work hours. I go to work early in the morning and leave before the busiest times. I want to take care of him as much as possible. That's why I asked everyone for help, and now here we are. I'm so sorry for all the trouble I'm causing everyone.
What are you talking about? If you keep looking that down, your husband's going to worry when you visit him.
Yeah, go see him with a smile and take good care of him. If things get rough, the manager can handle both the front and the kitchen if he has to.
Hey, what am I, some kind of superhero now?
My coworkers all laughed, full of good spirits. When I first asked for help, no one hesitated or made a face. In fact, they were the ones who suggested I leave early every day. Even the manager, despite how it might affect the business, adjusted the schedule just for me. I'm so lucky to work in such an amazing place. When life settles down, I'll definitely repay everyone for their kindness. With that thought, I thanked everyone and clocked out. I quickly got ready and rushed to the hospital.
Hi, Emily. Perfect timing. The doctor's with your husband right now.
As soon as I arrived, the nurse greeted me warmly. I hurried to Mike's room to find him talking with the doctor.
Hi, Emily. Glad you could join us.
Oh, you're done with work?
Mike, 2 years my senior. He was always mistaken for being younger than me due to his baby face. But ever since the cancer, he's aged dramatically. Now he looks his age, or maybe even older. The energy has faded from his face, and even his smile is weak. At first, he would smile and say, "I won't let this illness beat me." full of energy. But the body doesn't lie. Contrary to his words, he's been getting weaker and weaker.
I was just telling your husband about the progression of his illness.
How is his condition?
I'll explain it myself, doctor.
Mike interrupted, cutting off the doctor before he could speak. At that moment, a sense of dread washed over me. The doctor, seeming to understand, nodded, bowed his head, and quietly left the room.
Emily, how long have we been married?
Mike suddenly murmured, gazing out the window. Worried more about his condition than his question, I hesitantly replied, "It's been 30 years.
30 years, huh? It felt like a long time, but looking back now, it went by in the blink of an eye.
Don't say that. It sounds like you're giving up."
Another 6 months.
Mike muttered as he reminisced about the past. The way he spoke made it sound like he had accepted the end of his life, so I hurried to stop him from continuing. But he continued, turning his gaze away from me.
I've got 6 months left at most, probably less. I know my own body better than anyone.
He smiled faintly, lowering his head. And in that moment, my worst fears were confirmed. Tears welled up in my eyes.
Sorry, I promised you when we got married that I'd never make you cry.
Noticing my tears, Mike lifted his head and gave a troubled smile, gently wiping them away with his fingers. But I could see tears forming in his eyes too, which only made me cry harder. I couldn't hold back the sobs that escaped me.
When I get to the other side, I'll have to apologize to your parents. Sorry for making your daughter cry, I'll say.
Stop it. Life without him, it would be unbearably lonely. We used to joke about wanting to go together when the time came, so we'd never have to face life alone. But hearing him speak as if he'd already given up on living made me furious. Don't talk like it's over. You don't know that for sure.
Emily.
It's not set in stone yet. Medicine has come so far, and if we look for a different hospital, there might still be a chance.
I'm not going to make it.
As I desperately shouted, trying to reject reality, Mike gently held my hand and continued softly.
I'm going to be gone soon.
No, I can't accept that. I won't.
I want to do everything I need to before I go, and I want to spend every last moment with you.
With that, Mike began to share his wishes for the time we had left.
I don't want to spend what's left of my life in this hospital. I want to go home with you, back to our house. And I know you have work, but could you take a few days off? I want to go on that trip we planned. I want to fulfill all the promises I made to you. Please, let's make that happen.
He bowed his head deeply. And with that gesture, I was struck by the harsh truth. This wasn't a dream. This was reality. It was really happening. I realized I had to accept it, and though tears kept streaming down my face, I told the doctor about Mike's wishes. The doctor respected our decision and immediately began preparing for Mike's discharge. After some final tests, he would be able to go home the next day. And so, Mike was about to begin his final stay in the hospital.
Mike, I came to see you.
Hey, how's it going? Are you about to kick the bucket?
Oh, Emily, I didn't know you were here. I thought it was just Mike.
Since there was still some time before dinner, I decided to stay with Mike a little longer in his room. Suddenly, Sarah, Mike's brother John, and John's wife, Linda, came in for a visit. It's been a while, John and Linda. John, Mike's older brother, is 55, just 1 year older than him. He works in construction, though his habit of slacking off has left him without any real position, even at 55. He's just going through the motions at work. His wife, Linda, is 34, young and quite pretty. But her sharp features and even sharper tongue always left an impression. She's fine with other people, but for some reason she's always been hostile toward me. Then there's Sarah, Mike's 74-year-old mother. Despite her age, she's still full of energy. However, her nasty personality was evident on her face, and she was extremely greedy when it came to money. She adored John but completely neglected Mike. I can't stand Mike's family. Just like earlier, John often makes insensitive jokes without a second thought, and Linda probably dislikes me as well. From the moment we met, she's seen me as an enemy and never misses an opportunity to make a snide comment. As for Sarah, her treatment of me and Mike makes it feel like she doesn't even see us as people. She's only interested in him for his money. Every time we see her, the conversation quickly turns to money.
John has a big family, and you two don't have kids. You're both working, so you've got plenty of extra money, right? Can't you spare a little to help out?
It became routine for her to beg for money like that. John's family includes Sarah and a total of 9 people. His previous wife left him, and he remarried while raising 4 stepchildren. They had 2 children together, and their life became impoverished. Since they couldn't survive on their own income, they started begging us for money.
What do you all want?
What's with that tone? Your own mother comes to visit, and that's how you greet her.
Yeah, Mike, you should take care of your mom. She's been lonely ever since Dad passed.
The change in Sarah and the others' attitude began after my father-in-law passed away. He was a strict man, but very fair and reasonable. While he was alive, Sarah never acted this way. The family used to be close, everyone getting along well. But after his passing, it was like a weight was lifted off Sarah's shoulders, and she completely changed. The only reason she had been considerate toward us was because of her husband's influence. Once he was gone, she had no reason to continue and started treating me like an outsider. With Mike, all she talked about was money, and that's how things have been ever since. John had actually been disowned after he ran away with his first wife. But once their father died, he was welcomed back, along with Linda. Even though this town offers a lot of support for raising children, raising 6 kids requires a lot of money. Mike often expressed his frustration at how naive they were about that.
This month's been tough. We could really use some financial help again.
What? Are you serious? How can you ask for money when Mike is going through something like this?
Stay out of it. This is family business.
Exactly.
I couldn't believe the audacity of Sarah and her family, and I yelled in frustration. But John just brushed it off. Linda stood beside him, smirking at me, even making a shooting gesture like she was waving off a dog.
Sorry, but we don't have the money to spare right now.
That's not going to work for us. We came all this way because we figured you'd have something for us. You're really such a useless son.
Sarah muttered under her breath, not even caring if Mike could hear or not. At this point, I was about to lose my temper with these 3, who clearly had no sense of decency.
So, how are you doing? What's the status of your cancer, and when will you get out?
It was obvious she wasn't asking out of concern. Knowing Sarah, she had some greedy plan in mind. She probably wanted to know because it had something to do with money.
I have 6 months left. I'll be discharged tomorrow and I'll spend the rest of my time at home.
You're kidding.
The moment they heard that, Sarah and the others' eyes lit up. Instead of being shocked, they looked excited, like this was good news for them. It was a sickening sight, and I almost felt like I was going to throw up.
Well then, I'll come pick him up when you're discharged. You'll need a car, right?
No, thank you. Despite Mike's calm and polite response, Sarah and her crew continued to act inappropriately. I couldn't stand it any longer, so I forced the three of them out of the hospital room.
Hey, what do you think you're doing?
Leave. I'll handle everything on the discharge day, so there's no need for you to come. And I don't ever want to see your faces again.
What? Hey, don't you?
I slammed the door and locked it, cutting off whatever complaint Sarah was about to make. Immediately, I went to the hospital staff and explained the situation. I arranged with the nurse to restrict all visits except for me, making sure Sarah and the others wouldn't be able to see Mike again.
I'm sorry, Emily. I've caused you so much trouble.
Why didn't you stand up to them? They treat you like a fool and only care about you for your money. I was furious. How could such awful people keep living so freely while someone as good as Mike was the one who had to suffer? It might have been selfish to think that way, but I couldn't help it. I needed to let out my frustration. I didn't want to face the reality that Mike, someone I loved so deeply, was going to leave me.
I didn't want to put any extra strain on myself by arguing with them, but it made me happy that you stood up for me like that. That's why I have one last favor to ask you.
A favor? Then Mike entrusted me with something. What he told me was so shocking that I couldn't hide my surprise. But he was completely serious. Mike looked me in the eye and made sure I understood.
This will be the first and last thing I ever ask you.
I understand. With that, I took on the responsibility Mike entrusted to me, and that day I went home. The next day, before Sarah and the others could arrive, I quietly got Mike discharged. Though we were home, I knew Sarah would show up soon. I had to find a way to keep her and her family away from Mike. I made a slight change to Mike's original plan. Instead of staying at home, I arranged for us to stay at my friend's vacation house for a while.
I'll miss being at home a bit, but as long as I'm with you, it doesn't matter where we are.
Mike said with a shy smile, making me blush. After explaining the situation to my workplace, I took a long leave of absence. I wanted to spend every last moment by Mike's side. Thanks to the support of our friends, Mike was able to spend his remaining days in peace. 6 months later, he passed away quietly in his bed. At his funeral, Sarah and her family showed up. I braced myself for some kind of confrontation, but instead, they just smiled, looking at me with strange, almost creepy expressions. The sight of their grins sent a chill down my spine. What was that about? I soon found out exactly what their smiles meant. After the funeral, I returned home to start sorting through Mike's belongings. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there were Sarah and John standing at my doorstep, loaded with luggage.
We heard from the neighbors that you were finally back home.
What's with all that luggage? Sarah grumbled as she tried to push her way into the house. But I stood firm at the entrance, blocking her path. John glared at me, clearly annoyed.
What are you doing? Move out of the way.
I'm not moving. What's with all this luggage? And you brought your kids too. What exactly are you planning? Behind John, his entire family stood there. The situation was baffling, but I knew that panicking would only play into their hands. They were here with some scheme in mind. So I faced them with confidence. Then, with a mocking laugh, Sarah said something unbelievable.
Starting today, this house is ours. Get out, stranger.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah and her whole family, 9 of them, were trying to claim this house for themselves. I was so stunned by their absurdity that I couldn't even find words to respond.
It's only natural for my son's belongings to go to his blood relatives, right? Besides, I've got his will right here.
Sarah said, shoving the documents in my face. But instead of being intimidated, I burst into laughter, clutching my stomach. It was just too ridiculous. Sarah and her family looked so clueless. I couldn't stop laughing.
What's so funny?
Clearly offended by my reaction. Linda peeked out from behind John, glaring at me with annoyance. Still wiping away my tears of laughter, I delivered the shocking truth to them. You don't know, do you? This house is mine.
What? Huh?
Sarah and the others stared at me, utterly confused, their faces blank with disbelief. Their faces looked so ridiculously foolish that I almost burst out laughing again. But I held back my laughter and went to grab some documents from the room to reveal another fact. As you can see, this house legally belongs to me. Mike changed the ownership to my name while he was still alive.
What?
Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of a title transfer. She snatched the papers from my hands, and John and Linda crowded around her, examining them closely.
It's true. The house is in her name.
The documents were real, and my name was on the deed. Realizing that everything I said was the truth, John and Linda began shouting angrily. But I remained calm and continued speaking without a hint of fear.
This isn't fair. I thought the house was still under Mike's name.
We changed it when he got out of the hospital. Mike wanted to transfer ownership to me while he was still alive, so we wouldn't have any problems later on. Sarah, growing desperate, interrupted, thrusting her so-called will toward me.
That's impossible. I've got his will right here. Mike wrote this.
Sure enough, the paper had Mike's handwriting on it. However, it was just written in his handwriting with no signature or anything. There was no way it could function as a valid will like this. I sighed in exasperation at how ignorant and foolish Sarah and the others were. But no matter what I said, they weren't going to listen. Knowing what would happen next, I told them to wait for a moment while I made a phone call. Thank you for your help. Sorry to bother you, but Mike's family is here causing trouble over his will. Could you come by as soon as possible? Thanks.
Who were you just talking to?
Since I suddenly started making a phone call, John looked at me with a puzzled expression. Without offering much explanation, I told them to come inside. I led Sarah, John, and Linda to the sofa and instructed the kids to entertain themselves. Not long after, the doorbell rang, and I went to greet our guest. I invited him straight into the living room.
Sorry for the delay.
As the man in the suit stepped inside, John and the others immediately bristled with suspicion. They glared at him with hostile eyes. Not at all. I'm sorry for calling you on such short notice. This is Matthew, Mike's lawyer, who has been helping us with all the legal matters. I asked him to come because Sarah brought the will.
A lawyer.
The moment she realized who he was, Sarah let out a startled yelp. We were introduced to him through my friend who had lent us a vacation home, and we explained the situation. Since he was a young lawyer, only 30 years old, both Mike and I were initially concerned. However, our friend told us he was quick-witted and very skilled at handling family disputes. After meeting Matthew in person, we were convinced. He was someone we could trust with this. We explained everything to Matthew, from Mike's estate to the conflict with his family, and he became our official legal representative. It was clear that Sarah and the others had no idea Mike had hired a lawyer. They looked completely stunned, like they hadn't been told anything. John and Linda were just as wide-eyed, speechless at the revelation.
Allow me to introduce myself again. I'm Matthew Jameson, Mike's attorney. I'm here to discuss some matters related to his estate. For the sake of transparency, I'll be recording this conversation as it will serve as evidence.
In contrast to John, who had long, messy hair and a flashy appearance, Matthew had neatly trimmed short hair. He wore glasses to soften his sharp gaze and had a very clean, professional look. Sarah, seemingly forgetting her position, gazed at Matthew with admiration. He bowed respectfully to her. Sarah, along with John and Linda, returned his gesture, suddenly very polite. When she saw his business card and lawyer's badge, Sarah straightened up, realizing he was indeed a real attorney. John and Linda also straightened their posture, looking tense and serious. I sat down on the sofa next to Matthew, and our conversation began. Matthew smoothly activated the voice recorder, and the discussion began.
Sarah, you mentioned you had a will. May I take a look at it?
Matthew asked calmly. His steady tone seemed to unsettle Sarah, whose hands trembled slightly as she handed over the document. They were probably thinking that without someone to back them up, they might not get their share of the inheritance. That thought must have crossed their minds. There was no way they could out-talk a professional lawyer. They seemed terribly anxious, worried that things might turn against them. But Matthew silently examined the will that Sarah had handed him. After reading it over, he glanced at me and gave a small nod.
Thank you. I'll return this to you now.
Matthew handed the will back to Sarah with a polite smile. Perhaps his demeanor made them even more uneasy as they began questioning whether the will was legitimate.
It was Mike's will, right?
Yes, this does appear to be Mike's will.
See? This means the house is ours now,
Sarah said, suddenly gaining confidence. But just as she was about to celebrate, Matthew cut her off, the older one, that is.
What?
Sarah's face scrunched up in confusion, as if she hadn't heard him correctly.
I said, this is indeed Mike's will, but it's an old one. The valid will is this one.
Matthew pulled out a newer document from his briefcase, dated after Sarah's version, and read it aloud.
All of my assets are to go to Emily. The previous will written for my mother is null and void, and this is my final will.
What?
Let me see that.
Linda and John quickly grabbed the new will from Matthew's hands to inspect it. The newer will had a fresh date, a signature, and even a fingerprint, and since it had been arranged through a lawyer, it was obvious which will was valid. As Linda and John grasped the situation, the color drained from their faces, and Sarah's lips trembled.
Then, this will.
Is just a worthless piece of paper.
What?
The moment the word worthless was spoken, John turned his anger toward Sarah. Even in front of my lawyer, he lashed out at her.
Hey, what's going on, you old hag? You told me the inheritance was ours and that you had it handled.
John was hurling words at Sarah, looking like he was about to grab her any second. Linda tried desperately to stop him, but there was no way she could match his strength. John shook Linda off and continued to shout insults at Sarah. She cowered in fear. It was a chaotic scene. I couldn't stand it any longer, so I glared at John and calmly spoke. Would you mind not causing a scene in my house? You're being a real nuisance.
What did you say?
If you keep acting like this, we'll have Matthew here document everything and take it to court. The moment I mentioned Matthew's name, John stopped dead in his tracks. He knew he couldn't win against a lawyer. Being completely ignorant of the law, he realized there was no way he could win, so he hurriedly sat down on the couch. By the way, did Mike willingly write that will? Once things had calmed down a bit, I turned to Sarah with a question. It was clearly his handwriting, so it was only natural to think so. Though she seemed to be expecting me to agree, I stayed silent and waited for her response.
Yes, of course. Mike wrote it for me when he was in the hospital.
Really? Mike willingly wrote that for you?
That's what Sarah's been saying all along. What's your problem?
It must have felt like an interrogation, which clearly irritated her. Linda cut in abruptly from the side. Sarah nodded in agreement with her, and I glanced over at Matthew. He adjusted his glasses and gave me a subtle nod. That was the okay sign from Matthew, and once I got the signal, I revealed a certain truth to Sarah and the others. It's strange, because the hospital security footage shows you forcing Mike to write that will. I pulled a laptop from my bag and inserted my USB drive containing the data the hospital had provided. When I had first contacted Matthew, Mike had told him that he'd been coerced into writing the will. We explained this to the hospital, and they were willing to cooperate by providing the security footage. I quickly downloaded the data and displayed the footage on the screen.
We can't risk you dying and us not getting the inheritance.
The footage showed Sarah, John, and even Linda pressuring Mike to write the will, using what were practically threats.
If you don't want that woman to suffer, you better just write the will quietly.
Yeah, Mike. As long as you do this, nothing bad will happen to her.
The footage was from 3 days before Mike was discharged. Sarah and the others had asked Mike about the progression of his cancer as part of their plan. Their twisted intention was clearly to get their hands on the inheritance as soon as possible.
That's not true. We were just joking around.
Exactly. We were watching some TV show before going to the hospital, and the villain was so cool we were just copying him.
Come on, we weren't serious. Can't you cut us some slack?
Now that they knew they were in trouble, the three of them scrambled to make excuses. But their desperate words only fueled my anger. I could only sigh in exasperation at their pitiful attempts to cover up the truth. Not only do you refuse to admit what you've done, but you're actively trying to hide it. This is deliberate. Matthew, can we charge them with extortion as well?
Absolutely. And we've got it all recorded.
Matthew said with a broad smile as he picked up the voice recorder. John, Sarah, and Linda's faces turned pale as they realized they had completely forgotten about the recording. They were speechless, their mouths opening and closing without a sound. Given all this, I'll be making sure to file a claim for damages against each of you for what you've done to him.
What?
No, wait. Please, Emily, it was all Sarah's idea. We were just standing by. I never told him to write anything.
Linda frantically tried to distance herself from responsibility. Her words triggered a new argument between Sarah and John.
You all agreed to pressure him into writing the will.
You're the one who said you could handle it, Mom. We didn't do anything but stand by.
You were threatening Mike to hurry up and sign it.
That's because Mike's appointment was coming up. It wasn't about the will. We were just running out of time. If we waited too long, Emily could have shown up.
So, they had intentionally waited for a moment when I wasn't there. Linda unknowingly provided more incriminating testimony, but she was too caught up in the argument to realize it. The three of them continued their ugly dispute, and their children, who had been playing in the other room, eventually came over, curious after overhearing the argument. Some of them were as young as 2. I could see the fear in their eyes. The children were innocent. I understood that much. I quickly called over my oldest nephew, a 5th grader, and told him to take his siblings to another room, away from the adults' ugly dispute. Not fully understanding what was going on, he followed instructions and moved to another room, bringing his younger siblings with him. Once they were out of sight, I turned back to the 3 adults and said coldly, "Aren't you ashamed of yourselves? You call yourselves parents?
What did you say?"
You're standing here, blaming each other and arguing like children, right in front of your own kids. Don't you feel any shame? Passing the blame back and forth. It's pathetic." Linda, realizing what I'd said, glanced toward the door where the children had exited. Remembering how the children had left the room looking anxious, she came over to me, bowed her head deeply, and apologized. She pleaded desperately for forgiveness.
"I'm so sorry. I admit everything, forcing the will, everything we did. Please forgive us."
John and Sarah, desperate to salvage the situation, quickly followed her lead, offering their own apologies.
We've got to provide for our kids. Please, just don't take away the money.
If I have to pay damages, I don't know how I'll survive. Please, we'll make amends for what we did, but don't make it any harder.
They were crying now, pleading for mercy. But their words only made me angrier. In the end, all you care about is your money, your livelihood. You don't feel the slightest bit sorry.
That's not.
We're just struggling, and we wanted you to understand.
Do you know what that's called? It's called an excuse. John flinched as though struck by my words. Sarah and Linda had clearly been thinking the same. They were scrambling to apologize, though I wasn't about to let them off the hook. Before they could speak, I cut them off. It doesn't matter how many times you apologize. I'm not forgiving you. If you're worried about your children, then you'll have to work harder to make things right. If you hadn't done this to Mike in the first place, none of this would be happening. It's all your fault, so why should I have to forgive you? Doesn't that sound ridiculous to you? Their silence was enough. Now that you understand, leave. This house is full of precious memories, and I have no intention of sharing it with any of you.
Please, Emily, forgive us.
We were wrong.
Please, Emily, I beg you.
They desperately pleaded for forgiveness, but I coldly told them that if they said any more, I'd call the police. Realizing that getting the police involved would be a disaster. The 3 of them hurriedly gathered their children and belongings and left my house. Matthew and I watched them go, our eyes cold and unyielding. Once they were gone, we quickly locked the door behind them. Finally, it was over, and together with Matthew, I let out a sigh of relief. After that, I immediately asked Matthew to proceed with the process of filing the claim for damages. He had already prepared everything, so the process went smoothly. We filed a claim against the three of them for extorting Mike to write the will, totaling $30,000. When they realized they couldn't afford to pay, they tried to negotiate, but I refused to compromise. "You'll pay every penny." Since I didn't agree to any deals, their lives took a drastic turn. Sarah now had to take care of all 6 grandkids on her own, from morning until night. John and Linda worked nonstop, struggling to make ends meet. They sold their house and moved into a cramped apartment with all 9 of them. They did manage to pay off the damages, but their financial situation remained dire, and it looked like that lifestyle would continue until their youngest child turned 18. In the end, I successfully severed ties with them for good. Even after sorting through Mike's belongings, I continued to live in our house. I kept working, and sometimes my coworkers would visit, so I never felt too lonely. Hey, guess what happened today? Every day, I would look at Mike's photo and tell him about my day. "You made me a promise, remember? Even if I get weak and end up in the hospital, I'll keep talking to you every day." That day, Mike made one last request to me. It was to speak to him every day.
I love talking to you, and I love the sound of your voice. So, even after I'm gone, keep talking to me like I'm still here.
Those were Mike's last words before he passed away. And so, every day, until the day I join him, I'll keep that promise.